Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, a show that examines all aspects of sexuality, from physical to emotional to spiritual. Join our hosts as they discuss age-old questions, common misconceptions, and the latest topics surrounding sex. They'll tackle topics about sexuality from the complicated to the hilarious and everything in between. GSMC Sex Podcast is your show for all of your questions about sex, even some you might not have thought of yet.
Hello and welcome to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, Sean Johnson. You know, I was listening to my intro, and the very beginning, you have the intro with the young lady speaking over the track, and I was thinking about, wow, that really has that nice, sexy groove with the guitar and everything that's going on. And obviously the young lady is definitely a professional. I got to thank my executive producer for actually selecting that and making that as part of the intro music. And then we get to the other piece, and it's the bluesy rock kind of thing. It's a little bit of a slower pace. The first one is more like an adult contemporary sort of sound, and then the second one is more of a bluesy rock, kind of really just more earthy. And when I think about that, I start to think about, okay, what kind of music gets you into a more seductive mood? And do you like instrumentals, or are you into those songs with lyrics? Do you like women singers, or you like guy singers? And I was just kind of turning that over in my head, and some of the songs that just started to pop into my mind. I'm sort of a music buff, but there's a classic song that always evokes sort of a romantic feeling, and it's "Let's Get It On" by Marvin Gaye. I don't know if there's a person who doesn't know that tune exists. And if you want to reach into the Wayback Machine, and I mean way back, I think about a song that came out of the 50s, and it's called "Shake, Rattle, and Roll." A lot of people are familiar with the Bill Haley version of that song. And if you want to pull up the version, you can go to YouTube, pull it up, or any one of the many song libraries that are out there. But the YouTube thing tends to have a video that goes along with it. But the original artist for that song was a guy called Big Joe Turner. And there's a version of the lyrics that he sung that's pretty edgy. And when you think about sex and music, there's been a tie-in since the beginning of time, going back to just drum beats or something like that. There's always been a tie-in. But when you think about music and its connection to sex, some things are kind of out there in your face and others are more seductive. And when I think about instrumentals, it's really about the skill of the musician being able to bend notes and evoke an emotion with their style of play, and people can really connect with that. And when it comes to the lyrics, well, clever writing, I think, gets you there, as opposed to something that might be a little more edgy, a little more graphic. I tend to like writing that's more slick. Now, if you like something that's really graphic and it's out there, there's plenty of artists, and I don't have any shade to throw on them. They're great for what they do. But I'm just thinking in that conversation about, well, what kind of music gets you in the mood? But going back to this example of Joe Turner. Now, what I know about the song is he was the original, he was the artist who had written the tune, and it was covered by a number of people. When Bill Haley covered the tune, what's interesting to know is the song lyrics were tweaked a little bit, because Big Joe Turner's version, again, you got to think about the time. This was the 50s. His version was pretty graphic. And if you could go back to, like I said, you can pull this up on a YouTube and listen to it, and there's some lyrics. Again, it's pretty tame by today's standards. But like I say, if you think of the time period and where it came from, it's pretty edgy. I just find it entertaining. And I'm sure that you can find songs of any era, of any decade, that have more and more edge to it. And moving along, there was a tune in, I believe it was the 80s. It was Rod Stewart, Do You Think I'm Sexy? And that was really pushing the edge there for a lot of people because it was right out there. And it was a fun tune. And not kind of around the same time period, you had George Michael in I Want Your Sex. It was, again, right out there in your face. Very entertaining. And George Michael was quite the writer and performer. He was with a group called Wham, and then went on to have a very spirited solo career. And yeah, he passed away a number of years ago, but he is somebody who has had quite a number of songs on the air. And he wrote about sex not only in the in your face version, like with I Want Your Sex, but in a lot of his other tunes, it was a lot more subtle. And I think in the writing, you can see, or hear rather, a lot of artists dealing with their own sexuality or their own issues, whatever they may be, in their music. It's sort of cathartic. And, many artists talk about that for themselves. But it was just a thought that I had, thinking about music and, who you listen to, and certain songs get you in the mood and get you relaxed, and other songs kind of really get you up and get you going and have that edge to it. Whether you like saxophones or guitars or pianos or trumpets, or whatever your instrument is. There's a lot of it out there. Okay, that was a thought. Transitioning. Here's a health moment. I want to encourage people, young men and young women who are listening to the podcast, to be sure and get your HPV vaccination, human papilloma virus. I was talking to a pediatrician who had recommended there was a young man in my family who he was at that age where, I don't know if he was sexually active or not, but the doctor was explaining to me the value of young men also getting the shot. I didn't know boys would get that shot. I just thought it was just something for young ladies, for girls. But I'm finding out that they give the shot to young men also to help prevent them from getting the virus. It sort of inoculates them against that, protects them. And this is something that a lot of people contract, and there are other things that come along with getting the HPV. So get the shot. Obviously, talk to your doctor and discover if it is right for you, but it is definitely a conversation that you would want to be in. And thinking about this too, think back to, for those of you who would be old enough to know this, about 20 years ago, 25 years ago, we were talking about AIDS and how big of a deal that was at the time. It was literally a death sentence for people. I mean, if you think back to that time. And now we're at a place where people are able to live longer and productive lives because of the research that was done to help people that have suffered with that. And if you can recall early on when with the onset of AIDS, not only was it a death sentence, but the way it was transmitted, and people were so afraid that even if you were around somebody, they call it a virus. But when speaking of it in that terms, people who didn't know better would think that, it was something that you would catch like you could the flu. It was definitely sexually transmitted, as the research showed. But can you imagine the paranoia and the panic that people experience when discussing the disease? And obviously, we can look at things in hindsight and realize that our perceptions about things have changed because we have real knowledge about, number one, how AIDS is contracted and that it can be transmitted. When men have it, women have it, unprotected sex, how risky that is, and the importance of being checked out to see if you might be at risk for it. And this day and age, that there are medicines, there are vaccines that they can give to people to help them deal with the contraction of the HIV. So that is good news on the science front. Look, I'm going to take a quick break, and I will be back after that. Hello, welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. And think about this. These are just scenarios that could happen. If you have a roommate situation, meaning you and your roommate are just roommates, but each one of you has a partner. And how do you work out the details of when you want intimate time with your partner? Now, most people, in a situation like this, you probably have two separate bedrooms or somebody sleeping on the couch or something like that. But I can remember a time when a discussion about something like this obviously came up ahead of time so that you don't find yourself sort of in an embarrassing situation that you walk in on your roommate in the act, because that could be a bit uncomfortable. And, you see things that you don't necessarily want to see. But usually there's a signal. I mean, you kind of anticipate, look, if you're bringing your roommate is bringing their company back to the apartment, then, I don't know, what do? You tie a ribbon on the door or just know ahead of time that you've got company. And I think you have to have a couple of signals. One is which, if you're planning on bringing your company back to your apartment, ahead of time, great. But what if you don't have that worked out? Well, then you got to have some sort of signal, and hopefully something on the doorknob. And in this day and age, we have cell phones, tablets, iPads, things like that. You can send a text message and say, "Hey, I'm busy." But if you don't have that, then tie something on the door, anything, something discreet, something between you and your roommate, so that way and you don't have those embarrassing goof ups. So now here's another scenario, and I'm talking about this because these things actually come up. Let's say, now we all know that our parents have done the do, because if not, we wouldn't be here. But what if we are I don't know how many people were ever really comfortable about their parents talking about sex, their own sex. I'm not talking about the birds and the bees thing where they're telling you about it, but I'm talking about their parents talking about their sex life. I know a lot of people that kind of get weirded out by that, and it's sort of funny because we would just as soon talk about our own sex life, but when our parents start talking about it, we kind of like, oh, no, I don't want to even hear about that. And I kind of remember feeling the same way about my mom. Of course, my mom was so conservative, she never would have even brought up something like that. Not in that way. She might have said, well, maybe a yes or no that she ever did or something like that. But my mother would never, ever talk about details. But now we're in a day and age where parents are pretty open about some of their experiences because it's because we talk. We have communication about lots of things. And there's a lot of information out there. And by that, it starts the conversation. And some people feel very comfortable talking about their lives with their parents. And on occasion, if the sex thing comes up, maybe somebody might ask. But again, thinking about our parents and their intimate life. And I don't know how many people realize why their parents turned the music up. But your parents turned the music up because they didn't want to be heard having a sexual encounter, because they didn't want to traumatize the kids, right? As if the kids really knew what was going on in the room. And from time to time, I can remember people talking about their little kids kind of coming in on mom and dad when they were having their private time. And the kids wondering what the heck's going on in there with all that noise, right? The kids can't make noise, but obviously mom and dad's making noise. And then sometimes, well, mom and dad, they make their noise at night, and then, well, you know what's happening. So yeah, I went from talking about having a roommate situation and having a signal so that the roommates don't interrupt each other's personal time to talking about the parents having intimate time. Now here's a scenario, and this is something that happens quite often nowadays. It's people get older, they have partners, the kids are grown, the parents are even a little older, and the parents or mom or dad has a new partner in life. And what happens? Mom or dad with the new partner, they have a pretty active sex life. They're living in their own space. And if you were the kid, that would drop in on mom or drop in on dad's place and say, hey, you know, what's going on? And all of a sudden you might be kind of getting the information, okay, look, you need to call ahead of time before you come over because I may have company here. And we don't want to have an embarrassing situation, because I can imagine when kids, grown kids even, walking in on their parent having a sexual encounter with their partner, that could be a bit embarrassing. But hey, some people aren't bashful about it, and I figure if you're having your fun time with your partner, then just enjoy the heck out of it, and if the kids happen to see it, it'll teach them to knock first or not drop in. They'll learn to call. I got to chuckle at that. Because like I said, you know, when the kids see their parents doing the thing, the kids are weirded out by that. But hey, I'm not saying I'm wanting to see that either. But if something like that has ever happened to you, I think for the most part you learned really quickly the value of communication. I will call first. I know someone who tells me that her daughters say that when they see her mom with her or their boyfriend, they just imagine them just holding hands. They don't imagine them having sex. And I think the part of the problem is that the mom talks about the sex, and the kids know that the mom has better sex than the kids do. So it's sort of, and not that it's a competition, mind you, but I think mom really knows how to rock her man's world. So she's getting it every time she sees him. And I'm thinking that's a pretty good life. So to the kids who were wanting to complain about their parents and their sex life and that they're getting it on, well, if you're complaining instead of being happy for them, well, kick rocks. Because sex isn't just for the young. And no, that's a fact. Okay, and now just for clarification, that when I'm talking to kids, these children are grown children, and we're talking about in the 30s and almost early 40s. So if you could imagine that mom and her guy, they're probably close to early 60s. So like I said, they're getting it on. And to women who are thinking about their lives and what the possibility is for them as they get older, there is lots of possibility. So embrace it. That's all I could say. Embrace it. So now here's another scenario. And I've actually had this situation, and I let it go. I knew what people were doing, but I was in a hotel. I was resting, relaxing, and what do you think I heard? I heard the people in the room next to me, they were really having their intimate time. They were going at it. So, they were pretty robust. And it just took a while for it to pass. But if this were you, think about what would you do in that situation? Would you bang on the wall? In a hotel, yeah, what do you expect? It's a hotel. People kind of go away to have a good time. Now, if it's kids playing in the room and jumping up and down on the beds and stuff like that, yeah, you can knock that off, because that's not what a hotel room is for. Tell them they can sit down and watch TV. But if somebody's having their intimate moment with their partner, I don't think I would go over and stop that. Nor would I in an apartment complex. Unless they're kind of interrupting my sleep all the time. I'm not a spoil sport for somebody enjoying themselves, but sometimes it does help if it works with my sleep cycle too. But I've never had that experience where it bothered me. But I just have to imagine looking forward, if something like that were to happen, what would I do? Seriously, what would I do? Again, if I lived in an apartment, I just kind of said I would do something, but I don't think I would. I might sheepishly mention that. I heard you guys were having a good time last night, and just kind of say, hey, I do like to rest, but if you got it going on, I'm happy for you, but think about the rest of us. That's sort of a nice way to put it, but for what it's worth, I would never stop somebody from enjoying themselves. If they're having good sex, that's better for them, right? It makes them better neighbors. Look, I'm going to take a short break, and I'll be right back after this.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Hello and welcome back to Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. I'm your host, John Johnson, talking about things related to sex. So here's the question, and somebody had asked me this. I'm going to propose it as a question, and then I'm going to go ahead and answer it. And the question was, so what's a sex therapist? What's a sex surrogate? And what's a prostitute? What's the difference? So here's my explanation. A sex therapist works to help you deal with whatever sexual issues you have, no matter what they are. If you've you got some trauma issues, so that are related to you emotionally, and you need to work out what happened. You need to tell somebody you can trust, somebody who can help you get over or get beyond the trauma, so that you can have a healthy sex life. That's what a therapist helps you to do. And a sexual surrogate kind of works in the same way, but is more hands-on. See, the therapist isn't really going to be a hands-on kind of person, because that sort of crosses the line for them. But a sex surrogate, which sex therapists oftentimes will contact in your behalf and arrange a meeting of some type, so that the sex surrogate is more the hands-on teaching type of situation. So if, say for example, if you're a guy and you've never really had sex, or you've been really clumsy at it, and you just can't seem to get this thing to work, and you've had a few encounters, and maybe you're just embarrassed about the whole experience, well, then a sex surrogate might be somebody who gets brought into the situation. And some people use the occasion to see a sex worker, commonly known in many jargon as a prostitute. So they say, what's the difference between a sex surrogate and a prostitute? Well, primarily, a sex surrogate there's the teaching aspect of it. And if you're a guy and you're seeing a prostitute, the idea behind that situation isn't so much teaching as it is you are just hiring a lover for a period of time. And once that time frame is over and done with, then it's done. It's not necessarily a professional relationship, although it can be. And there are many instances in which something on that level, the intimacy, and none of these situations are initially designed to be relationships per se. And of course, there are stories about how guys fall in love with the hired sex worker, and in the case of that, they want to become a rescuer. They want to get him out of the business. Well, that's a whole other aspect. But those are the kinds of scenarios that happen when you're dealing with sex workers. Prostitutes is another word. I don't mean that in any derogatory term. I'm just kind of giving you a definition of the scope of the work that they do. Again, as opposed to therapists, that is sex therapists, sex surrogates, and then somebody who's hired as a sex worker they're obviously, when you spend time with them, maybe you will learn something from them. But as I would understand the encounter to be, it's more of a transactional relationship, where there's money exchange in favor of, and the favor being sex itself. It could be for, a period of time. It could be for an hour, a couple hours. It could be for, a day, a couple of days, whatever the time period that you agree upon. But again, it is understood that that's more of a transactional kind of relationship, and sex is expected. Whereas with a surrogate, there is, again, more of a teaching situation where you will learn about sex. There may or may not be any intercourse when it comes to that. And, it's interesting. In all of my understanding, I have never heard of a guy who is a sex surrogate. And I'm sure they're out there. But all of those that I have read about, they've all been women. And I'm gonna have to do some research on that and find out if there are actually guys who are sex surrogates. Now, we know that there are guys who are escorts, and that's another word for a sex worker. Who and there's old terms for that. I can't say that I'm up to date on what a new term for that would be, but they used to call them gigolos. That was a word that I remember being thrown about some time ago. And I mean, you can look that word up. And there was even a movie called American Gigolo, and it has Richard Gere and I can't think of the lady who was in the film. It'll come to me later. But Lauren Hutton, that's who it was. Old film. I think it was, I don't know if it was 70s or 80s or something like that. But you can probably get it on Netflix or something. But just the same, when you have people who are in the business, there are those, and I'm making a real distinction about transactional relationships where there's money exchange and favors for sex, as opposed to teaching situations, which is what a sex surrogate is. And then there's the sex therapist who oftentimes, along with the assistance of a sex surrogate, can help a person deal with sexual related issues. And if there's been, some emotional trauma around it, and if you are a person who has experienced something like that and you've been wondering, what's the difference, then hopefully this clears it up for you. And if you have something to deal with, do some research, find a competent therapist, and work with them to help you get past whatever trauma or things that might be preventing you from having a fulfilling sex life. Now, something to think about. Maybe you don't know that you are having issues around sex. It just hasn't dawned on you that that's actually something that's happening to you. If you're having a lot of anxiety around it, I'm making a distinction from what I said a moment ago, because there are people that have been through something that's been traumatic, and they already know that. But let's say that you're just, from your perception, you're just not aware of something like that that's happening to you. But if you're having a difficult time being with an intimate partner, then that for you might be a flag to say, hey, maybe I need to talk to a therapist about what's happening for you now, whether you want to be with a sex therapist or just a regular counselor. You can decide for yourself which may be a better choice for you. But given that it's the anxiety or something that happens around a sexual situation, maybe a sex therapist is the one for you. If you're having a sexual encounter and things just seem to come up for you that are really, really difficult, and you can't be in the act of being sexual without having something come up for you, again, maybe a regular therapist would be a good choice, or maybe a sex therapist. So there's plenty of options out there. And again, I encourage you that if you're having difficulty with that, to see a competent therapist and work through that so that you no longer have that burden to deal with. I'm John Johnson. This is the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows from the GSMC Podcast Network. From sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Sex Podcast.